Good morning, and welcome to the First Unitarian Universalist Society of Albany. We especially welcome visitors to our service. My name is John Newell, and I am the service associate for today. This morning, we welcome to our pulpit Dr. Sigrun Newell, who was a Peace Corps volunteer in Ecuador in the mid-60s. She joined this congregation over 40 years ago and the choir more recently. She has served on many committees, including as chair of the Religious Services Committee for a couple of times, and she has run the craft fair for the last 7 years. There's a small change in the order of service. What if we were going through this last night after it was all put together? We tried to shorten things a little bit. So instead of Sigrun doing the call to community, I will do the reading. The reading is excerpted from The Invention of Nature by Andrea Wolf. They were crawling on hands and knees along a high, narrow ridge that was in places only 2 inches wide. The path, if you could call it that, was layered with sand and loose stones that shifted whenever they were touched. Down on the left was a steep cliff encrusted with ice that glinted when the sun broke through the thick clouds. The view to the right, with a 1,000-foot drop, wasn't much better. Here, the dark, almost perpendicular walls were covered with rocks that protruded like knife blades. Alexander Van Humboldt and his 3 companions moved in single file, slowly inching forward, without proper equipment or appropriate clothing. This was a dangerous climb. The icy wind had numbed their hands and feet. Melted snow had soaked their thin shoes, and ice crystals clung to their hair and beards. At 17,000 feet above sea level, they struggled to breathe in the thin air. As they proceeded, the jagged rocks shredded the soles of their shoes, and their feet began to bleed. It was the 23rd of June, 1802, and they were climbing Chimborazo, a beautiful dome-shaped inactive volcano in the Andes that rose almost 21,000 feet, some 100 miles south of Quito in today's Ecuador. Chimborazo was then believed to be the highest mountain in the world. No wonder that their terrified porters had abandoned them at the snow line. The volcano's peak was shrouded in thick fog, but Humboldt had nonetheless pressed on. It was, he said, as if we were trapped inside an air balloon. Then, suddenly, the fog lifted, revealing Chimborazo's snow-capped summit against the blue sky. A magnificent sight was Humboldt's first thought, but then he saw the huge crevasse in front of them, 65 feet wide and about 600 feet deep. But there was no other way to the top. When Humboldt measured their altitude at 19,413 feet, he discovered that they were barely 1,000 feet below the peak. No one had ever come this high before, and no one had ever breathed such thin air. As he stood at the top of the world, looking down upon the mountain ranges folded beneath him, Humboldt began to see the world differently. He saw the earth as one great living organism where everything was connected, conceiving a bold new vision of nature that still influences the way we understand the natural world. Please join us in the chalice lighting. Sigrun will lead the words, and I'll do the lighting.
welcoming all free seekers of truth and meaning. We gather to excite the human spirit, to inspire its growth and development, to respond morally and ethically to a troubled world, and to sustain a vital and nurturing religious community.
Sigrun has chosen a wisdom story today called Alexander Van Humboldt, Explorer, Naturalist, and Environmental Pioneer by Danica Novgorodov. Through it, we will learn a lot about Alexander, who was a remarkable person and all the things he did, which are pretty epic. As a wealthy European man of the 18th and 19th centuries, Alexander's ideas and discoveries were certainly new and exciting to him and his peers. It is also true that many indigenous cultures were already holding and honoring the concept of interconnectedness before Alexander's time, and of course living in the places that he traveled to. I invite everyone to take a look after service at the author's note from this publication, which is posted on the bulletin board in Channing. Here she shares what inspired her to make the book, some facts about Alexander that set him apart from his peers and some of the practices of his time, and some context about the use of the phrase New World and why indigenous people look the way they do in the book's illustrations. And now, on with the story. All alone, in the German countryside, Alexander watched the clouds. How can I describe to you the beauty of the sky? That hawk looks so alone up there, he thought. But then the hawk dipped and caught a mouse that had eaten a nut that had fallen from a tree that was watered by rain that had come from the ocean. Now I see, Alexander thought, that the hawk is not alone. She is connected to the earth and sea and sky. At home, his brother teased him about the plants in his pockets. His mother scolded him for dirt on his knees. And his tutors thought him slow and strange. Nobody understood him, so he spent his days outside, exploring the hills and the hollows. How sad to wander about alone, and yet there is something attractive in this solitude when occupied with nature, he wrote. As Alexander grew, his curiosity did too. He had so many questions. Why do frogs have long legs, but snakes have no legs at all? What is the earth made of? Are the mountains in Europe taller than the mountains near the sea? Is the earth hollow, or is it full of iron, or coal, fire, or gold? Why are plants and animals alive, but rocks are not? Why do palm trees have huge leaves and pine cones have tiny ones? Why is there volcanic rock along the River Rhine in Germany? Alexander wanted to be an explorer like Captain James Cook. Cook had sailed to lands made entirely of ice, lands thick with rainforest, and lands with fire-breathing mountains. Where does the lava come from, Alexander wondered when he read about volcanoes. Perhaps there was a small coal fire burning inside each volcano, like a flame inside a stove. Alexander wanted to see for himself. Reading about Captain Cook's adventures, Alexander felt a flame of his own burning bright. From my earliest days, I felt the urge to travel to distant lands. To prepare for the journey he dreamed of making, he studied everything from mold to meteors and explored everywhere from the depths of mines to the soaring Alps. And finally, one day, he boarded a Spanish ship and sailed across the vast Atlantic to the coast of South America. This new world is so different, he thought. Everything is gigantic. Mountains, rivers, and the mass of vegetation. Alexander hiked across the rugged plains of Venezuela. These creatures are so different, he thought. But when he looked closely, he noticed that just like at home, the hawks were sharp-eyed, the lizards had 18 toes, and the large cats were spotted. Now I see, he thought, that animals all over the world are connected. In a canoe, Alexander paddled hundreds of miles through the Amazon rainforest. When it threatened to rain, the macaws started a terrible racket. The toucan tried to fly to the shore to fish, and the titi monkeys ran to hide under Father Zay's long sleeves. He met many people living in villages deep in the jungle. The people here are so different, he thought. But when he got to know them, Alexander realized that the indigenous people spoke interesting languages, made beautiful music, and studied the geography of the land, like Europeans did. Now I see, he thought, that people all over the world are connected. Alexander traveled west to the Andes Mountains of Colombia. This land is so different, he thought. But when he climbed Prairies volcano, he discovered that, just like in the mountains at home, the plants got smaller and the air got colder as he climbed up and up. Now I see, Alexander thought, that habitats all over the world are connected. Alexander traveled south to Quito, now the capital city of Ecuador, where he climbed one volcano after another, after another. He had so many questions. Why are there so many active volcanoes near Quito? How are they different from the volcanoes in Europe? What types of rocks are the volcanoes made from? Alexander noticed that the volcanoes were arranged in a chain stretching south of Quito. He called it the Avenue of the Volcanoes. Was it just a coincidence that the volcanoes were arranged in a chain? Alexander didn't think so. By studying the volcanoes, he understood that they were not lit by small separate coal fires like most scientists supposed. He believed that the volcanoes must be connected underground, heated up by forces deep beneath the Earth's surface. And he was right. Now I see, Alexander thought, peering into the fire-spitting crater of Pichincha, that the volcanoes must be connected to each other and to the interior of the Earth. But then, a terrible, stinking, sulfurous smell wafted from Pichincha's crater. The volcano began to rumble. We were forced to tell the people, Alexander wrote, the sad news that their nearby volcano is on fire. The people of Quito accused Alexander of angering the volcano gods by throwing gunpowder into the crater. But Alexander explained that eruptions were caused by underground forces beyond what humans could control. Some people didn't believe him, but many others began to listen to his ideas. Soon, people all over the world would be talking about Alexander's explorations and discoveries. After his Pichincha expedition, Alexander set out to climb the giant volcano Chimborazo. It was believed to be the tallest mountain in the world. No one had ever reached its peak. In 1802, Alexander climbed so high he could barely breathe. He climbed so high he felt dizzy and sick. At the snow line, his porters became frightened and turned back. But Alexander kept climbing. He had almost reached the summit when he came to a wide ravine filled with snow. It was too deep to cross and too steep to climb. Frozen, tired, and weak, Alexander had no choice but to stop. I am like a hawk in the sky, Alexander thought, all alone. But then the fog began to lift. Alexander saw the snowy summit above him and a dash of blue sky. He saw the ridges of the mountains far below, a magnificent sight. Then the clouds parted, and from his perch at the top of the world, Alexander saw that the volcanoes formed the land that sprouted the plants, that fed the people, that were kin to the animals, that roamed the earth and sea and sky. Now I see, thought Alexander, that everything is connected. On Chimborazo, Alexander had climbed higher than any human being had ever climbed. And from that great height, he no longer felt alone.
After that book, I scarcely need to tell you anything. You got it all already. But it's nice to hear it again in a different way. Darwin is familiar to all of you. You know that the data he collected while traveling around South America on the ship Beagle was the source of his ideas for evolution. But you may not know what Darwin himself said. Quote, "I would not have gone on the Beagle had it not been for reading the works of Alexander Van Humboldt." Humboldt lived from 1769 to 1859. He spent 5 years at the turn of the century traveling around South America. At one point, he and his companions spent 4 months walking 1,000 miles from Quito, Ecuador, walking for 1,000 miles, and that was only a little piece of the journey. I'd like to tell you more about this fascinating man. 125 years ago, the world was very different. No television, no movies, and certainly no internet. The great majority of people never traveled beyond more than 100 miles from the place they were born. Transportation was by foot, farm wagon, or carriages pulled by horses. On water, it was canoes, rowboats, or sailing ships. Compared to our fast, crazy pace, everything moved slowly. However, everyone was curious about the world. Books and newspapers were their window into the great wide world. Into this context came a German scientist, explorer, naturalist, Alexander Van Humboldt. Highly energetic and insatiably curious, he was described by a friend, quote, "He was just like a little boy with his pockets bulging with plants, rocks, and scraps of paper." In Germany, Humboldt trained as a scientist, but he was also a friend of Goethe. The two young men spent long hours talking about art and science. From Goethe, Humboldt learned that he could be both an artist and a scientist. As a result, Humboldt became a superb writer. Wherever he went, he sent letters back to Europe to be published in journals and newspaper articles. I should point out that the letters had to wait for a sailing ship to go back. It could take many months for what he wrote to actually arrive in Europe. His book, Cosmos, became an international bestseller. In a time when there was no other entertainment, this book was a center of conversation. Like Einstein today, Humboldt was a scientist that everybody knew about. For 5 years, he and botanist Aimé Beauplan and a cook named Jose traveled through Central and South America. Humboldt and his botanist companion started from Spain, stopped at Tenerife in the Canary Islands, sailed to Argentina, made a circle of exploration, the little one you see on the map, sailed to Cuba, left all the things that they had collected already there, and then went on to South America to hike the Andes, the great big loop you see on the map, and then to Mexico, back to Cuba to pick up their stuff, then to Washington, D.C. to visit Thomas Jefferson, finally back to France. Other than on the ships, most of their travels were on foot with pack horses to carry their data collecting equipment. In Europe, people waited eagerly for the next letter, full of tales of crocodile-infested rivers, endless sun-drenched grasslands, and icy mountaintops. Readers were intrigued by his vision. Through Humboldt, people changed the way they looked at the world. I first got excited about doing a service exploring Humboldt's life and its influence because it was clear that Humboldt's vision was the source of our Unitarian Universalist seventh principle: respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. But as I explored further, I realized that he also wrote passionately about issues covered by our first, second, fourth, and sixth principles. Let's start with the seventh, the interdependent web of all existence. Before Humboldt, scientists thought in categories. They made great long lists of individual species. On the other hand, Newton saw the world as a giant mechanical clock with intermingling gears. In the 1700s, there was no concept of nature as an entity in its own. It fascinates me that we can trace the idea of the web of nature to one man, Humboldt, and one moment when he stood high on Chimborazo, looking down at the land below. Humboldt and his co-explorers, climbing on foot, reached 19,000 feet. There we have the photograph. That's one that we took, a friend of ours took when we were there. He wrote that this climb, starting in a jungle, was like a journey from the equator to the poles. He said, "At a single glance, the whole of nature was laid out before me." He understood that all these things were connected, as in a web. I should stop a moment here to point out that Buddhists and Native Americans had believed in the interconnectedness of nature long before. Here, I'm talking about Western science in Europe and America. When Humboldt and Bonpland returned to Quito, they discussed this vision. Humboldt began to sketch it out as a drawing of mountains and all the plants that lived on them. It appears that Humboldt had a photographic memory. He could remember every plant he'd picked and every animal he had seen on all of his explorations, hold them all in his mind at once. One of his drawings shows 5 mountains side by side. I don't have a slide for that one, but it shows 5 mountains in different parts of the world. Even though they were of different heights, the drawing of the mountain plants on their slopes remained the same. Here you see Humboldt's most well-known drawing, which is Chimborazo. And all those little dark lines that you can see there, those are plant names indicating which plant was found where. With this drawing, Humboldt was the first to portray the intricate connections of living beings. This work of art was something that people could understand and talk about. Somebody said that this was the very first infomercial. Our sixth principle is the goal of world community. Humboldt believed deeply that all scientists around the world should be connected to one another and should share their information freely. In his lifetime, he wrote more than 60,000 letters and received double that number in return. As I said, things moved more slowly back then. Through this correspondence, he created a worldwide community of scientists. Throughout South America, as he traveled, Humboldt was often dismayed at the damage caused by colonialism to the environment. For example, in Venezuela, he visited a lush agricultural valley surrounding Lake Valencia. But the lake levels were dropping precipitously, and the land was drying out. Peasants were starving who had previously had productive farms. His data made it clear that forests that had been cut down for timber had formerly shielded the soil from the sun and controlled the flow of water. Where trees had been cut, there were floods. In Mexico, Humboldt observed that land which had once been fertile had been overexploited to make space for cash crops. He was the first to equate colonialism with the devastation of the environment. He wrote that the web of life isn't only about plants and animals, but also includes man's place in it. Humboldt's description in 1800 of his observations at Lake Valencia and in Mexico were the first widely known descriptions about how humans were creating climate change. In place of the 1700s belief that God gave humans command over nature, Humboldt argued that we must understand nature and how it works. He said, if not, there could be catastrophe. And here we are, 125 years later, dealing with disastrous floods and hurricanes. If only we had listened sooner. In criticizing unjust land distribution and monocultures, Humboldt also criticized violence against tribal groups and indigenous peoples. In their isolation, most Europeans thought of all indigenous people as savages. But Humboldt and his companions had traveled with indigenous people and come to know them as individuals. In his book and letters, he argued that there are no superior or inferior races and that all human beings came from one root. Humboldt gave readers all over the world the vision that, as we say in our first principle, there is inherent dignity and worth in every person. Humboldt spent 5 years traveling in Central and South America, and the rest of his life proclaiming what he had learned there. He was the first to discuss the interdependent web. He advocated for the inherent worth and dignity of every person. In arguing against colonialism and its slavery, he proclaimed justice and equity for all. By collecting and recording data wherever he went, then searching for the meaning of that data, as he tried to make sense of what he had, Humboldt was a wonderful example of the responsible search for truth and meaning. It is ironic that a man who was once a famous scientist has been almost forgotten because his ideas have become commonplace. We talk about ecology, we talk about all these dignity of other human beings. All of this is just so common. It's the air we breathe. We don't stop to think that it had to come from somebody who thought it up in the first place. His vision is now the foundation of our faith. It is good to know our heritage.
This is a time for meditation and prayer. I will start with a poem called The Sacred Hoop, written by a Native American named Black Elk. When I was standing on the highest mountain of them all, and round beneath me was the whole hoop of the world. And when I stood there, I saw more than I can tell, and I understood more than I saw. For I was seeing, in the sacred manner, the shape of all things of the Spirit, and the shapes as they must live together like one being. And I saw that the sacred hoop of my people was one of the many hoops that make one circle, wide as daylight and starlight, and in the center grew one mighty flowering tree to shelter all the children of one mother and one father. And I saw that it was holy.
Many of you know that I fell about 6 weeks ago and cracked my pelvis, so I'm needing a little extra help these days. Without Humboldt, we would not have had Darwin's theory of evolution. Without Humboldt, we would not have had Thoreau's book, Walden Pond. Without Humboldt, we would not have had Yosemite. Without Humboldt, we would not have had Tiffany glass. Here's a brief look into how Humboldt influenced 4 thinkers and artists who have been influential in our time. At the beginning, I quoted Darwin as saying he would not have gone on the Beagle had it not been for Humboldt. Once he was on the Beagle, 6-foot-tall Darwin had a tiny space in a hammock hanging just below the ceiling in a room shared with other men above a large table where nautical chairs were rolled out. Next to his hammock, Darwin had a bookshelf with his most valuable books, botany, geology, and 7 volumes of Humboldt's book, Personal Narrative. Hanging up there in his hammock, Darwin had terrible seasickness. But, he said, there was nothing like reading Humboldt for cheering the heart when he felt miserable. Darwin was captivated by Humboldt's ideas, which became the basis for his growing understanding of nature as an integrated whole. Historians have found, in the margin of the 5th volume of Personal Narrative, Darwin's penciled-in notes showing the very first inkling of his thinking about evolutionary theory. Humboldt's style of writing combining science and poetic description, was influential in Darwin's writing and was very important in having people understand and accept his ideas. This made The Voyage of the Beagle an instant success. Darwin was only 30 years old when The Voyage of Beagle was published. Darwin, with trepidation, mailed a copy to his hero. Humboldt replied that if his own work had inspired a book like The Voyage, then that was his life's greatest success. "You have an excellent future ahead of you," wrote Humboldt. In 1845, 20 years after he got back from South America, Humboldt published his book Cosmos. He took its title from a Greek word meaning order and beauty created through the human eye. This too became an instant bestseller. When translated into English, this was one of the books that influenced Darwin. In America, it also influenced Edgar Allan Poe, Emerson, Walt Whitman, and John Muir. The book Cosmos also gave Thoreau the courage to write Walden Pond. In his daily walks, Thoreau collected plants and put them in his hat, which he called his botany box. He made copious notes of everything he observed. After his 2 years at Walden Pond, he had lots of notes, but struggled to make them into a book. He had 2 sets of journals, one for poetry, one for scientific observation. Until he read Cosmos, Thoreau couldn't figure out how to combine the two. Humboldt inspired him to see that each detail that he observed was a thread in a beautiful poetic tapestry of the natural world. Thoreau came to realize that he did not have to journey around the world to follow his hero's footsteps. He could be an explorer in his own backyard. We will never know how many young men read Humboldt and eagerly set out for South America, or what happened to them. But you know what happened to one of them. Visitors to San Francisco often go to Muir Woods to see the giant redwoods. It is fitting that the Redwood Grove is named in honor of a man who worked so tirelessly to save them. At the end of the Civil War, John Muir walked 1,000 miles from Indianapolis to Florida, where he planned to catch a boat to South America. Quote, "How intensely I desire to be a Humboldt. I'm desperate to see the snow-capped Andes." But malaria made him change his plans. Instead, he went to California. Hating the muddy mayhem of Gold Rush San Francisco, Muir walked to the Sierra Nevada and Yosemite. Muir spent many years exploring the mountains and sleeping under the open sky. When Emerson came to visit, Muir was disappointed. Emerson wanted to sleep in a tourist cabin. Muir said this was a, quote, "a sad commentary on the glories of transcendentalism." For the rest of his life, Muir fought to protect nature. He published a dozen books and more than 300 articles that became a wake-up call for Americans. Like Humboldt, Muir was a fine writer, dazzling his readers with playful joy. When President Teddy Roosevelt came to visit, Muir convinced him to make Yosemite into a national park, thus protecting it from development. Ernest Haeckel is another name that has been forgotten, although his influence surrounds us daily. 60 years after Humboldt stood on Mount Chimborazo, Haeckel invented the word ecology. Founded on the Greek word oikos, meaning household, Haeckel defined ecology as a science of relationships of an organism with its environment. In doing so, he moved Humboldt's concept of nature into the 20th century. Like other visionaries I've discussed, Haeckel had to find his own way, combining his love of art and his love of science. His inspiration was the microscopic study of minuscule creatures called radiolarians. Similar to diatoms, they have exquisite, subtle structures of spines and hooks. Haeckel had the amazing ability of being able to look down a microscope with one eye and with the other eye look at the piece of paper where he was drawing. Thus, he could come up with highly detailed, accurate pictures of these beautiful microscopic creatures. Haeckel fell in love with the origin of species because it opened a new way of explaining the creatures he was drawing. He became Darwin's most ardent advocate in Germany. Haeckel's books sold more copies than Darwin's. Haeckel's beautifully illustrated books introduced more people to evolutionary thought than Darwin's. His drawings made evolution visible. Starting in 1889, Haeckel wrote a series of booklets called Art Forms in Nature. This introduced scientific inquiry to artists. At a time when the world was becoming overwhelmed by the Industrial Revolution, artists were looking for a way to return people to nature. Haeckel's books became the foundation of the Art Nouveau movement. There's one of his drawings. You can see how elegant it is. Here's an illustration by Haeckel of a jellyfish. Tiffany loved Haeckel's sea creatures because their fluidity matched the fluidity of glass. Here is an example of a Tiffany window in the Art Nouveau style. There are several Tiffany windows just across the street from our Unitarian Universalist Church here in Albany, at the library of the State University. There are many other such windows in Albany and Troy churches and elsewhere. You can visit these windows and contemplate the way one man standing on a mountaintop in 1802 has influenced us in myriad surprising ways. Deep peace of the running wave to you. Deep peace of the flowing air to you. Deep peace of the quiet earth to you. Deep peace of the shining stars to you. Deep peace of the infinite peace to you. And now we extinguish the chalice. Please read with us. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.